there was a couple of bits that I've seen recently. Yeah. Not being a Yank, I don't particularly care. So I never really focused on what the actual declaration said
Mm-hmm.
and in what particular order it said it,
Yeah.
other than my little trope of tax dodging key terrorist as a welcoming fact with various people who live the other side of the pond.
Well, we did spend a lot
there-
more time sort of complaining about King George III in a whole laundry list of things that tended to be forgotten.
There's a laundry list, and somebody did a video the other day that gave the details and read out, but without the fluff. The 27, apparently, if I remember rightly, 27 items. And they're clearly in, although they're not a bulleted numbered list in quite the way we would do it today.
In a PowerPoint,
they are clearly in some level of priority, as in get your soldiers out of my house, and particularly get the foreign soldiers, as in the Hesse, out of my house.
Yeah.
They're not even English like we are, thankfully. And so back in the day, there was the guy whose actual name I forget now, but he used to front himself as Beau of Fifth Column on YouTube. He stepped back and I think it's his wife, who's now the front person, but with basically the same journalistic thing behind it. It was her doing this thing, like on the second and the third of them. And with a lot of things, I'd never actually really put down a detailed timeline, like what I would have done for my history for, say, like, William the Conqueror coming. So I know the numbers there about let's go against the Vikings, let's go up to Stamford Bridge, let's walk all the way back, etc., etc. So the whole series of bunch of dates then, and a certain amount of logistics and stuff that us Brits and learn. But it's like your first shots being fired were back in April. Was the declaration as written came out normally, but the second was published on the 4th, I think. And the list, when she read it out, I thought was quite interesting, in the sense of it's, and how much she deliberately, because I haven't bothered to go back and actually read the 1,300 odd words, and I was trying to get through the book, how accurate her reading is, and without favour of her reading versus the things like the habeas corpus type thing, the right of kings. Because by then, we'd had our glorious revolution and all those things. That's what put William and Anne on the top.
And that was huge in New England history as well, right? Because that got rid of Andros, who was, sort of James's agent in America. And he had created, sort of this province of New England, which included New York and New Jersey, and was sort of operating. I mean, at least he was perceived as operating, more autocratically, and he sort of suspended the colonial legislatures to whatever extent they really existed.
Yeah, I think the things that I see from what Bell, who took over Bell, the Fifth Column YouTube channel, was saying, one of the biggest ones, of course, was we've got this problem with we want to expand, but you're not giving us any more charges to take floor space. And
I think the proclamation line was much bigger than we've ever given it credit for having been.
Yeah, no new colonies, therefore no expansion, no progress. We want more space, we want more land. And
they believed that is what they had just fought the 7 Years' War for, the French and Indian War.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. And oddly enough, somebody else had just been doing. Oh yeah, a guy does the history movies thing. He focuses on the big historical films. He doesn't care too much if the story is fictional. What he wants to see is the cinematography and all the technology that they're showing is correct in context. So although he's done Lawrence of Arabia and Waterloo, because the stories are true and the context has knock-on effects. He's also done
that Gods and Generals is incredibly accurate with respect to the costume and the weapons and all of that and the movements on the battlefield and all that, while at the same time completely getting the overarching story wrong. So there's kind of an issue with that.
Yeah, but the movie that he did that I happened to rewatch was The Last of the Mohicans, which of course is all in the 7 Years' War or the Indian-French Wars, or however you want to put it.
Right.
and it gave a lot of the context, but also added, of course, and the idiot that caused the diplomatic incident that kicked it off was some guy called George Washington.
George Washington, yeah. But he's not in it. He's not in it. But General Gage gets wiped out in it, doesn't he? So that's an interesting. I love that Daniel Day-Lewis. But that was produced by Michael Mann, the guy who had made Miami Vice. So it was very cool and stylized.
So I had The Last of the Mohicans historical check. As it's a fictional story, there are a dozen or so people who are real, including General Monroe, Gage, and French guy whose name I forget. But almost everybody else in the movie is not real.
And the Hurons are the bad guys.
Yeah, obviously, they were because they were on the French side, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, but it's kind of funny. He would be a good metaphor for the. But imagine as Candiaronk, though. So I love Wes Studi. I thought he was the best thing about that movie. I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis was great, but Wes Studi was epic.
But the context of setting Last of the Mohicans reminded me of all the context for the 7 Years' War in French. And of course, the other thing of the film, particularly, I'm not sure about books, I've not read it, was of course they slipped in a lot of stuff when it became personal on the Declaration of Independence, which Bell's channel didn't pick up on it.
Right. Well, there's that whole passage about having brought on the merciless savages.
But in the way of, we want the militia, we own the militia, we're going to have you house our foreign soldiers, we're going to limit your capacity to grow with no new charters. So there's all that 21 list, and it's like number 25 out of 27, 24 out of 27, with no representation on the taxes. And as though that's virtually incidental, but you're also you're overly controlling the customs and excise, you're overly controlling the judiciary, you're overly and all those things that are important that
Mhm.
you see in tiny elements of odd bits and pieces of various other Hollywood shows of the War of Independence,
Yeah.
excluding the Mel Gibson one. There's a
Yeah, there's, but
there's,
but
there's
the thing about the thing about controlling, controlling trade and controlling, especially shipping, right, was that one of the things that they instituted were these sub-admiralty courts, right, where rather than having having people charged with smuggling, judged by a jury of their own peers and allies in the colonies, right, now all of a sudden these sub-admiralty courts were going to be military tribunals, which were going to be much less forgiving. So people like John Hancock were seeing that as a direct attack on their profits.
and as a British MP, ex-MP, did a few shorts, so they're an hour or less, 50 minutes saying various programs on different aspects of British history. And one of them focused on the First and Second World War. Another one focused on the change from the East India Company to the British Raj and what mechanism did the 2,000 odd people from Britain that were there use to control the increasing millions that are now a billion. And there was also one which I went back and watched after the Bell thing on the Declaration, on your particular of the War of Independence, and particularly of the retaking of New York and holding of New York because of the blockade equivalent, etc. And the way that
they had collaboration in holding New York too, because New York became the center for loyalists, right? And so to a great extent, it was a civil war as well.
And of course, as far as we were concerned back then, what we now know as what we view as then as Upper Canada with British Canada and Acadia were French. It's all part and parcel of the Virginian wars that we were speaking about. Some of those buildings still exist. So he was doing some of the visuals in those buildings. So you had hideaways and chimney breasts, and mostly focusing on Washington's intelligence spy network, but not exclusively so. And that all rolled into for the people, of the people, by the people. Your closing paragraph of the 1,300 words. And I go, actually, I'm sure I've heard somebody else say it. And of course, it's also paraphrased. It's not exactly the same. It's paraphrased in the last paragraph of the Gettysburg Address. That made me wonder and think a bit more about who, when, and why did the peoples in the negotiation needed 3/5 of a man, such that the southern states didn't lose population out because of all the slaves, free slaves or otherwise. But we need the 3/5 man to be an adequate count to make sure we get our representatives, not the senators. Two senators to rank. The representatives are by the population number. Hence California getting 60 odd votes or whatever it is. And it's like, there doesn't seem to be, and I'm sure there was, and it's probably still going on because you keep seeking to have to rehash all of this stuff. And you see it in Nethercott's Richardson, you see it in other areas, you see it in Project 2025. They didn't mean this, they meant that. It's like, how would you know?
Right.
And
Well,
then you go, okay, so when the women get the vote, how did they get the vote? What was the mechanism to say that by the people is now men and women, white as well as black?
Mhm.
And there was a comedian on that just managed to dribble into my field of vision the other day, who was Arab. It turned out that in between the two wars, there was a Syrian Arab who was one of the first policemen. And he was clearly, obviously not white.
Mhm.
And in court, somebody sued him for arresting him. And there was obviously no police union back then. And the city decided to sort of let him dangle on the rope on his own. So it was a person-to-person suit, not a person-to-department,
Mhm.
which is a bit stupid because the cops are not going to have any money to collect. And his lawyers said, okay, where does he come from? No, he comes from Detroit or wherever it was. No. Where does he come from? Oh, Syria. Where's that? No, that's Levant. Okay. Where's Jesus come from? The Levant. And Jesus is white, right? Because apparently the basis of you can't arrest me is you're not white.
Okay.
Even though you're a policeman in uniform. And apparently that's why people of the Middle East, including all the Israeli Jews and all the rest of it, are white in terms of your census definition.
Wow. That's crazy.
So, right, maybe you'd be able to check that for me. Because that was in the context at the moment, I don't know how much, because you've been busy last. 30-odd people have been arrested for protesting on Parliament Square, including an 80-plus-year-old priest, because they've been supporting a Palestinian pressure group who are saying what's happening in Gaza now, okay, happened 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago. What's happening in Gaza now is genocide. And they have repeated and pointed to Glastonbury, which is the big rock festival in the UK. It's just happened, where a couple of the acts decided to squeeze in.
Right. That made huge news over here. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the protest groups put a whole bunch of their Jewish supporters and other clearly white people into the protest on Parliament Square, and they all got arrested. Such that this pressure group, which is wholly peaceful, trying to get medical aid and food aid in and all the rest, and making sure it stays in the news cycle, is now a proscribed in the UK organisation. Because rather like you see in things like your big beautiful bill and various instances of the West Wing, people stuff stupid crap into your bill progressing through your parliamentary system.
Right.
This pressure group got added at the last moment into a list of like 10 other gun-toting, bombing terrorist groups that were being prescribed with the basis of you're not going to fuck this bill up because of your one protest group, as opposed to all these terrorists. And it passed. So they're a proscribed group. And I hadn't realised that we actually used the word proscription in the same sense as the Senate did in the Republic and the Empire were. As in, it made them a criminal. The only difference, of course, is back in Roman times, it allowed you to go and kill them and take their money.
I want to jump in here, Tim, because as I've been jotting down things, you've jumped from one topic to another a couple times now. And before you do it again, I want to kind of respond to some things that you said along the way. Because what you were saying about sort of the Palestinian and the nation the nation of Israel issue, there's been a lot that did get a lot of press over here in America, the death to the IDF and all of that stuff. But the and there was a lot of and I won't rehash kind of the commentary and the argument that was had sort of in the blogosphere over that, or the podcastistan or whatever they call it. But one of the things that I think is interesting in the context of this question about stories versus realities is kind of something that I jotted down while you were speaking about sort of who are these people and who are the contemporary residents of Israel, the nation of Israel right now, and who are the contemporary Jews, and this whole concept of anti-Semitism, when the Semitic thing is kind of a cultural identification now and not an actual genetic thing, right? That most of the residents of Israel are not Semitic. They're European. They're Europeans, and so it strikes me that there's this interesting sort of battle of stories going on, not realities. And similarly, the question of the 12-day war, right? And this idea that have we knocked out any type of Iranian nuclear enrichment capability? Were they really on their way? Did they have that intention? Were they working towards it even? Did we knock out something that didn't exist and therefore now we can say that it no longer exists? Or ironically, did we sort of encourage them to do something that they hadn't actually been doing previously? So there's all of these kind of wheels within wheels within wheels in reality. And it seems like the argument that's being had in the media is on the basis of some type of clearly unreal stories, and the question of which one is going to win out is going to have some consequences for for how whether this war actually resolves itself or whether it turns into a forever war, or whether Netanyahu can manipulate Trump into something more or what. But it does seem like that the battle that's being had is on whether the media is going to allow Trump to say mission accomplished.
So, okay, mentioned before, there's Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, of course, and the Rest is Politics podcast, which is pretty big, and you've got an American version with other people. They did a recent Q&A where the first question came up about media fairness in the presentation of the Gaza. And oddly enough, Alistair had just Jew had been part of a group that was going through all the media coverage to try and measure the It's much varies, but what's being covered where, when, and why. In fact, and it's found the likes of the BBC, where the tone of the word clearly pro-Israel, pro-IDF, yet even this long after the 7th attacks, it's like you've incarcerated them, you've bombed them, you've turned the water off, you've stopped the medical, and on top of that, you're sniping people that are going to your designated aid station.
Food.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things particularly that came up from the UK perspective, there's been at least 3 British aid workers that are designated in Red Cross, Red Crescent, whatever track of I'm not Gaza, I'm here helping, but got sniped, literally sniped. There has been no discussion, either at the BBC or in Parliament. The government's not allowed it to come outside of pushback, ambush type questions that may have been on.
Mm-hmm.
And
what about your power of petition?
I haven't seen one of them, but I
feel
have
like it's easy enough to get, to use Twitter or social media to get over the line for.
I'm sure there would have been 1 or 2 already last. But the other thing, of course, is once they get to 100,000 signatures, they have to have a debate. But the debate doesn't have to be in Parliament. It could be in a meeting room, so a committee room, in effect. So a bit like your grand jury hearing type.
And it
still has to be public. Still has to be public, but it doesn't have to be televised. So they could easily do it, and because it wasn't necessarily televised, the spread isn't there. But I haven't seen it happen or not happen. But I had seen a couple more relatively recent, climate change. And we've recently pushed through we want to build next number, I can't remember the was, of more housing to try and solve the housing crisis. They've got the stimulus problems. But the green side of the world is up against it because part of the solution is to remove the power of stopping development because of legislation in place for wildlife and environmental.
Well, I mean, and nowadays you can be prosecuted in Britain for saying the wrong thing. So is that putting a damper on people actually speaking out and publicizing things on social media?
Yeah, there's an element of, particularly on the green side of the energy, carbon, climate type stuff. There's been a lot out on the edges of the legislation. So slowly but surely, it's become more difficult to just spray paint a window and say it's political. And it's criminal damage, full stop, you're in prison. So there's 4 or 5 people that I, chat to in other contexts who are either in prison currently or have been, or have been through the court and managed to get a custodial judgments or a judgment of innocence. And a few people that support that process quite heavily, they support the process, but they deliberately do not make a statement themselves, because rather like a marshal at a protest, I'm here to be stood as a marshal between the civilian authority and the protesters to manage the protest, not to take part of the protest. But there's quite a few people who monitor the process and or make sure that they get prison visits with lawyer capacity. Although I've crossed the boundary this year, whereby technically speaking, I'm the Brazilian sentence, because I've said, oh, look at this, or that's wrong. And yes, as I started off with, yesterday, 25, 30 odd people got arrested for protesting that we could protest about that particular group who's now being prescribed. There are people, including friends that I know and I help or whatever, are in today's version of that. So I don't know whether I'll be able to talk to them tomorrow directly.
Wow.
We'll see.
Wow.
But I thought it was quite strange in the context of the last bits of this book that it's like if we, and we've said a couple of times in relation to this book, now say that in the context of what we know from reading the Big Myth or the American myth, because there's a big overlap between those people. Albeit the American myth was a wider context. Obviously, Susan Conway's The Big Myth was much more focused. So part of my last bit of rushing around to read the finish, I thought, oh, I wonder how often two particular words always struck me. How often do you think the word corruption is in the current book? And how often do you think the word monopoly is in the current book? Two big words that could be part and parcel of an economics.
Well, I've got to imagine
Corruption.
that the answer to the monopoly question for Hayek is probably verging on zero, right? Because that's not a topic that he would want to address.
Right, I'm glad you gave me that answer. Corruption is there once, and it's in the appendix where he's talking about the Nazi treatment of the Jews. So it's after the end of the normal part of what's in an appendix once. So corruption in a commercial term, in a free market, clearly does not exist in his mind. He's not mentioned it at all.
Right.
Monopoly is mentioned once in chapter 1, 10 times in chapter 4, 3 times in chapter 14. But in the middle of that, chapter 13, which is part of this cycle reading, Totalitarians in Our Midst is the chapter title. There's 12 plus times.
Okay.
And it's clearly.
And what does he mean when he says monopoly?
Well, it's all about the way, and I'm surprised he didn't use the word corruption within that context, about the way the economics is corrupted by
Planning.
the extreme fascism, Nazism type president. And of course,
well, that is.
I did check.
Austrian.
I did check how many times he used the word fascism and the national or Nazis.
Yeah.
But he mentions Nazis quite a bit.
Yeah.
Partly because of where he came.
that is kind of a claim that the Austrians will make, right? Is that monopoly can only really exist with state collusion, right? That there really aren't any competitive
Well,
situations.
we know that's not totally true with what we've read in the Big Big. But
Right.
we also know that, again, with what we saw and read in the Big Big, that once it becomes a little bit more transparent
Right.
and
Well,
most likely
I think that it's easy.
information.
It's easy for him to point to a lot of, I mean, if he's talking about Mussolini's Italy and, and Hitler's Germany, there's a lot of monopoly and cartelization and, and that sort of government action to promote business consolidation that he can point to. But that doesn't mean, and his mistake is in claiming that because he observed that and because there's a lot of that is the only way that you get to these outcomes. And that I think is kind of a big, and it's interesting. It interests me that, I kind of coming out of this book, I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to have to spend some real time with this, kind of really digging into all of the sources that he cites, because I think that it really does probably give a lot of insights. I think he talks about some really, really interesting stuff that I hadn't run into before. And I'm thinking, okay, I need to read this now, with a less, I think that he fitted into his kind of predetermined, interpretation and used it, to his advantage in his kind of diatribe against planning or whatever, and state action. But I do think that underneath there, if you read it, more impartially and kind of more, with a little bit more openness to kind of what's going on and, on both sides. I think there is kind of a hidden history in his sources of kind of how we got from really pre-World War I, from that status quo ante to the interwar period, and then to kind of the decisions and the choices that were made by the people who were decision makers at that time, who of course were the old men who had the experience of both the Second World War and the First World War and remembered something about what had gone on previously. So I think that is interesting, because I think that the sources that he used probably do explain that change, but not necessarily in the biased way that he's kind of used them, and the biased kind of conclusions that he's made. So what's going on in the chat? Let's see. We've got Putin. So what are we? Oh yeah, oligarchy and
yeah. So your examples of Mussolini and Hitler kind of being strongmen and controlling governments in the way that they did is not very dissimilar from where Putin is sitting now in his, post-glasnost perestroika, oligarchy building. And if you don't fit into his thing, he takes your fiefdom and gives it to someone else and uses that as the means of propping himself up, while he's simultaneously spinning publicity for himself through state-run media to kind of keep the rest of the people in line.
Yeah, well, and I saw an interesting, I don't know if I didn't verify it, but I saw a statistic, or somebody claimed that to be reading statistics, and said that in the last 10 or 20 years, 14 Chinese billionaire oligarchs have been executed. So apparently it's a dangerous position in China as well to occupy. But the whole grab that was made, of all of the state controlled industries, and especially, natural resource extraction like oil and gas and stuff, was I mean, I don't think anybody even try. I think that the people, who want to take Hayek's position just try to studiously kind of ignore that stuff because there's no way that they can claim that that was, some type of a move towards a free market.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of waiting for, with this, particularly with the fight between Trump and Musk, for Trump to say, "Hey, I'm a businessman. I can run and do what he's been doing better than he can. So let's move him out of the country and I'll take over his company and we'll run it better than he could have as a pretext for following the same strongman positions that he seems to be." But it's going to take somebody within his administration to take that on as the thing to do. The same way if somebody like a Stephen Miller has said, "I'm going to take the lead on illegal immigration."
Yeah, I think that Musk's companies will last all of about 5 minutes. Now, I'm not claiming that that Musk is the singular genius behind every development that those companies have made, but I do think that he has been kind of this pivotal inspirational character in bringing together people who thought that they were doing a thing and still, I think, to a great extent, think that they're doing a thing. And if he is eliminated from that role, I think you're going to see an immediate, massive brain drain. These people will just flee like cockroaches when you.
And go back to your 14 plus Chinese guys.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
And getting back to your 14 Chinese billionaires, practically.
Oh, yeah.
Report UK by today, yesterday. Was it another Russian apparently went through a window?
Hmm.
So it I don't know whether anybody's going to count on how many windows have had to be replaced in Moscow over the last 20 years. But so that would be an interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So the quote from the Gettysburg Address. What do you want? Yeah. So what about that resonates?
It was the reuse of for the people by the people element that was part of the population. And the context of which they were going through.
Yeah. Well, and that
said, and the 27 or whatever it was items of we need to solve these problems. As I said, number 23, 24, whatever it was tax without representation. But of course, you real roads having your local votes being taken on.
Well, of course, and what Lincoln did give us was a national income tax and loss of habeas corpus for a while. So there's reality and there's rhetoric again.
It's one of the things that I think of in the context, and this thing that comes out when that other amateur British literary historian mentioned who's very much into the whys and wherefores of the politics is we can't beat the British to get to an empire. What empire we did have got taken away under their side. So therefore, where does the British Navy will go? Well, France, Poland, Russia. So let's go that way. Because we know we want the space. I mean, is what is the resources that it needs. And at that point, of course, Ukraine was a major oil and they were allies with the mission. So you go that you get our oil. And there's another American guy in the United States. Who are figuring high on YouTube, both of which are talking about the processes and the way that, particularly the Japanese, did do Pearl Harbor just for more successful the British and the Dutch. And they would have had all the oil they would have needed because they were short of money and short of wisdom. And given they never actually invaded American territory to go mine gold in California, etc., waging into the Pearl Harbor. And the other knock-on effect, of course, Pearl Harbor was the outcome of that was Vietnam did something that he'd never done with it, which was declare war without actually winning. There was no declaration of war against Poland in the Soviet Union or France. He just invaded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and he declared war without invading. So yeah.
Well, he declared war. Therefore, put lead of your civilian ships in the thing.
Well, but there was
target on their back.
There was no act of There was no act of war. So the declaration. So apparently, in his logic, the act of war sort of precluded the necessity of a declaration. But what is the the point?
I don't believe there was a German Japanese in fact, in the sense of later than the war goes and
That seems to be the expectation.
I don't think there was, but there might have been. But it's compared to France and the UK saying we're going to protect Poland around.
Right.
But put my head back into the book.
Wow, Chris is demonstrating his technique as we speak.
I somewhat, and I haven't done anything after chapter 16 on the conclusion, other than doing worse.
Oh.
So, and therefore know about where the word production. The other thing that's come up for other reasons in other research is more on the so-so free market element that keeps going on, particularly with the monopoly in chapter 13, but only via a totalitarian process of monopoly. That notion, as he says, that the free market has the other people problem of your pollution shouldn't be my problem.
Your what?
Your pollution should not be my problem.
Yeah.
Yet it clearly is.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back and look at the rest of the Austrian economic point, the reasons of the which was.
Well, their claim often is that there are externalities, but that in the grand scheme of things, they're trivial, and so we shouldn't allow. I mean, it's almost like what Obama used to say, right? We shouldn't allow perfection to sort of derail us from doing the best we can. I don't remember exactly the phraseology that he used. Perfect is the enemy of good, or something like that.
But we still should watch out for people who are, just strip mining the land and turning spaces.
And there's a lot of that blinders. stuff, right? I mean, I'm not agreeing with them at all. I'm just saying that they, that seems to be the excuse when they do put on those blinders.
Yeah, it's one thing if you're gonna mine rare earth metals so that economically we can move forward and have energy sources and batteries and compete. But when that space becomes a Superfund site a decade hence, and then suddenly individuals and corporations have massively profited from the process, and then you've dumped the end cost
Right.
decades later into the lap of
Hmm.
profitize the gains and marginalize the losses, or put the losses back onto the little
Right, and
people.
privatize the gains and make, and just make the losses and the costs everybody's problem. Yeah, make them part of the public sector.
Well,
That yeah.
it's similar there. It's a small piece, and it's hiding right now, and I presume as time goes by more coverage will unveil it. But if you look at the energy policy that's hiding in the big beautiful bill, a lot of it goes into effect over the next decade. And it's not going to happen immediately, but there are massive changes that hamper. And in part, I'm sure it's the Republican Party saying we don't like renewable energy, and we want all our money going to old traditional coal and gas, and the people who are funding and writing us checks to keep us in power. So there are huge provisions that take a big chunk of renewables out. But the issue is over the last 20 years, US consumption of energy has gone through the roof. And we've only been able really to keep pace because of renewables being a thing. So just at the point where we need more and more energy, and our energy demands are rising roughly at the rate of 13%, I think was one of the recent numbers I saw.
Mhm.
They're literally hamstringing a lot of the additional production. The oil and gas can't possibly pick up. So
Right.
while you're sitting in states like Texas in particular right now are having energy shortages, and it's almost an energy crisis, over
Hmm.
the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to see that getting massively worse because of provisions that were in this big, beautiful bill. And then they're going to cry and scream and point, presuming D Democrats or somebody non-Republican takes over, then they'll all cry and scream and say, hey, the other side is in power at the time the energy crisis hits, but the energy crisis was,
Right. Well, and
constructed
they'll say, so
literally
this is their
yesterday.
fault. This is of their making. Right. But
Yeah.
the issue is, I mean, the broader issue, aside, in addition to kind of what's in the bill and whether or not, there will even be, Republican administration in, when the time comes to really try to implement these things, so there's that policy thing. But then the reality is that even if you wanted, and I my source for this is Chamath Palihapitiya on the All In podcast, because he's been harping on this again and again and again and again, and I think I have absorbed it to the point that I can synopsize it for you. So we are trying to go from 1 point something to 3 terawatts, or whatever the measurement is, of national electric capability in the next 5 years or so. China's going to go from 5 to 8 in that same period. Right. So they're going to, at the end of this period that we're of expanding the grid and all of that and modernizing the grid, we're going to get to the end of it, and China's going to have 3 times as much accessible electricity, right? And and he was saying that he got involved in, he's building a data center for the first time, and it's downstream from a nuclear power plant. But he said they wanted to have gas turbine, backup system, and he said you can't get a gas turbine, you can't buy a gas turbine. The delivery dates are somewhere between 2030 and 2032, right? And
Yeah. At least 7 years out.
right. And ironically, the closest thing that you can get, and you can't, and permitting a new nuke, puts it into the 2030s or the 2040s as well. But the thing that you can turn around in 17 months is solar with storage sourced from China, right? And so whatever the policy is, whatever is in the bill, right? The reality of the situation is that the only thing that we could turn around, and the only thing that people who have billions of dollars to invest see, a less than decades kind of window for return on investment is renewable. So, that's the situation.
Well, and particularly while we're trying to like ramp up for AI costs, which are, a huge energy suck.
Huge.
That nobody's really paying attention. Yeah, your short little chat GPT search seems innocuous, but
right,
it costs something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, this is gonna be a great chat. There's a lot of good links in here. Thanks, Pat.
Back in 2000.
And that's the reaction that people are having to it is, we have to, that again, and again, this may be, I think that it is a sincere argument on the part of some people who are alarmed how far behind America is falling in this race for energy dominance, because energy dominance equals AI dominance, I think, in a lot of people's minds. So if we're, so I guess in the same way that a lot of people, when they're talking about AI, are saying, well, people are trying to sort of put checks and make the development of models, and the use of, and the scraping of the internet for data for these models more legal, right, and more legitimate in terms of doing things like protecting people's copyrights and all of that. The argument that people are making with data is that, of course, China's not going to do that, right? And so we've got this, I think some people are using it as an excuse. Other people are legitimately sort of concerned about this, right? That that if we lose this and America, basically kind of becomes what it seems to be, destined to be, and a lot of people seem to be fighting tooth and nail to prevent this from happening. That we become, a number 2 or number 3 player in, and we're no longer the global hegemon. That will be some type of existential threat. I think a lot of people assume to not only the U.S. but to the to Western civilization.
Back in the day, 2000, 2002.
Can you put your microphone a little bit closer, Tim, because you're kind of going in and out, and it's hard to track what you're saying.
Back in 2000, 2004, I was doing data centers across Europe. The one client, they happened to be funded by Apollo, and they wanted collectively, they wanted to move so far. Going back to what you said about the procurement time, the resources, they effectively had to go out and buy two manufacturers of UPS their entire year's production at a chunk. And of course, the companies weren't quite so stupid. And so they said, okay, we want, and of course, we added over a barrel terms, which basically 120%. And so you're buying a whole year's worth of output, premium of 120%. And then, of course, you manage to slip a few out of the production stream to go service your other smaller client. So I was, amongst other things, apart from going to the data centers, building and testing and that, was having to go to the factories to go and test before delivery and check capacity. But it was taking serial numbers like billion to make sure that, number 95 to 247 were the ones that got delivered, because that's this year's production. And although they were after the dot-com bubble, they went fast because they just couldn't sell the space, sell the servers. or the space faster. And it seemed like a real odd thing. But now, strange. Apparently here, it's just been given 300 million plus worth of AI slow chips. We're putting up a new data for them. It's like, it's clearly going to be a cooling problem. And here, the district cooling systems that make them furtherly efficient are wet systems. So then we need to produce the water. Then the evaporation of rain under the wet system, as opposed to smaller scale stuff. It's normally air cooled, so there's no, it's water involved, but there's not the consumption of water involved. So one of the larger ones I think was in Frankfurt. It was large. You were saying about terawatts a moment ago. The one in Frankfurt was only 64 megawatts. But in Frankfurt, it was something that needed just over 100 cubic meters an hour of evaporation water. So if you think that you're upping your provision to go from no gas cookers, heat pumps for no gas furnaces, data centers and electric cars, and data centers have been growing as a percentage as well, faster than the new build of power sources. Then, if you're running cooling systems because it's data centers, if you're putting them in Texas and Nevada or New Mexico, we've got a cooling problem. You've got an attached water problem. More than what you have by saying production of lettuce and almonds in California and stupid. A data center, because of high school network, doesn't really need to be where the population,
Right.
or where there's space. It needs to be where there's cooling. And
Well, it needs to be where there's electricity. Yeah. So
it needs to be where there's electricity.
So if you're running it off of solar, it's got to be Arizona or Texas.
Out of the ones I did, the most overall efficient one was in Oslo.
Yeah. Well, and that's the irony is that for the longest time there, I used to use in my environmental history, I used to use images of Germany when, because for a long time Germany was leading in solar deployment, and they're actually the insolation that they get, the solar radiation that they get on an averaged daily basis throughout the year is about the same as Alaska. But they were leading. Tim, what's the temperature 10 feet underground in Arizona?
Well, if it's the same as it is here.
Right, it's 55 degrees, right?
Well, 55-ish is the air temperature in peak July, August.
Yeah.
Unshaded. But the road surface in 3 p.m. July, which was the one time I had to measure, 105 degrees Celsius.
Yeah. Right. And you can fry an egg on it. Yeah.
Yeah. You can cook quite easily. I mean, solar cookers, great as Florida, they work quite well here. We've got even less clouds. But our domestic water from utility, when you bring it into a normal villa type accommodation building, you swap it over in your shower to go from the hot cold to cold hot. Because from the water heating, you turn it on, it sits in the AC air exhaust pipe, number two. It cools down 24/7.
Mhm.
So you get 20, 25-degree water from there. And the incoming cold water, it becomes your hot, and you get a really good 40-odd degree shower. And that 40-odd plus degrees is what the water picks up coming through the ground 10, 15 feet down.
Mhm.
So Arizona's not going to be any different.
Yeah.
And within the city, of course, you're shaded by the buildings and all the trees.
Yeah.
Certainly not that many buildings,
Mhm.
but out in the desert, you're a long way from the water in most cases. Except, I mean, if you look at the map and you turn the terrain picture of the Google Maps, and you go to a place here called LA, A-L, new word, A-I-N. It's at a geological change, and it forces the groundwater up to the surface. And it's great. It's the garden city of UAE. It's also one of our brands of bottled water because they grab the water, put it in a plastic bottle, sell it. But it's in Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi utility also grabs water, puts it in a pipe, and sends it to the city. And biggest single problem they have is at some point you need to call the water down. So back in the day when I was working over on one of the hotels here, we had 3 sets of water going to taps. There's hot water, cold water, and cold. And the cold water went to the cook, all the kitchens, because the cold water would cook the sushi before the chef had finished plating it up.
Oh wow!
Because even though it's cooled down inside the losses within the building, it's not cold enough. And the same because we had a big fish display, multiple tanks. Lobsters grow based on temperature, mostly. So to stop the lobsters eating their food, we just struck off their shell because they need to grow, and the shell doesn't grow.
So they molt, yeah.
It expands up, and then it hardens off, but it takes an hour or two you get eaten by your mates. So we're sending 5-degree water to the lobster tank to stop them growing too fast. The bulk of the other tanks are getting 25-degree water, which we're taking from the sea at summertime, 45, not quite 50. And we're taking it from 50 meters down. We've got pipe work going 200-300 meters out to sea. We're picking it off the bottom.
Yeah.
But there's not that. The thing you say about the average German solar gang versus the Alaskan, the problem there is, of course, Alaska's got stupid daylight in the summer.
Right.
So when you talk about average, that's the problem. But it doesn't tell you, the average doesn't tell you how big a piece of plant you need at midnight in December to carry on cooling or heating the building.
Right.
Versus, can I use the solar power to drive some sort of trombone type ventilation that gives me some cooling to knock off my heat, which you can do. I mean, it's a case of, well, we're going to insulate the building because of noise and infiltration and strength. to stop people penetrating the building. So all of a sudden, we've got a Scandinavian level of insulation, but for other reasons. And then the other quirk that comes up that is not automatically thought about is if I keep adding insulation to a chilled water that's outside, at some point the diameter becomes such an efficient collector, you start to gain more heat than the insulation projects again. So you've got a point at which the more sensible thing to do is shade the pipe, not insulate the pipe further. But that never happens under heating requirements, except you can obviously put a collector attached to the pipe if you're here and you want heating. And I was at the point of could I get what's known as a Stirling cycle. We all know about the normal vapor compression cycle that does now with refrigeration and freeze cycle, our air conditioning in houses. There's a similar one called the Stirling cycle that says, give me a heat source to drive the compression. But at the other end, gives me the ability to take away this. Therefore, can I collect heat at the right time of day, drive a refrigeration cycle at the other end, so I don't actually need electricity even to drive the refrigeration motor, but I still need electricity to distribute. So I've even more of a heat pump type situation, because I'm pumping the cold around, but I create the cold for free, except I've got this relatively very inefficient thermal driven process called the Stirling engine. So I need a much bigger collector. But if you're trying to do that in Germany or the UK, you've got a bigger problem. Whereas if you're doing it here, where the average temperature here is 20 degrees centigrade, and the peak in summer is 50, 55 unshaded, thus I could collect. And the upside is I'm that much closer to the equator than most of the US. So I've got a much more fixed thing. But because I'm nearer the equator, I'm more close to the 12 and 12 day night. It's 13 and a half to 10 and a half is the range here. But if you get to like Singapore, it's 12. Because Singapore's only like 3 degrees off the equator. But we're just above the top of the cancer band, where you're more close on your solar day. The other quirk here, of course, is midday prayers is solar midday.
Is what?
Is solar midday, not midday. So here it gets cooled at about 25 past the hour. Which means you can't, it's reported in the paper, because obviously the other prayer times are hours before and after sunrise, sunset, midday, etc. So, and they change slightly, 13 and a half to 10 and a half. But every day that's published. And every day they're all slightly different. A bit like sunrise and sunset is always slightly different.
Right.
And more importantly, the work with the wobbles, so now that we have minutes and seconds, we can tell because of the wobbles, and we've just passed the solstice. the sunrise keeps getting early after the sun, but the sunset happens earlier, faster, for a short period, and then suddenly starts to get closer back again to sunset. So then, but you only notice it if you're okay. Every hour I check where it is, and I know the hour because I've got the mechanical watch.
Yep.
Not using the solar dial levels of the San Angeles thing to measure it anymore. I've got a clock. And obviously, once we got clock clocks, we also figured out that things like the leap year, leap day, leap second, leap hour.
Okay, let me redirect us to the book.
Last thing before I forget.
All right.
You spoke about the fact that you've got a signed copy of Economics in a Day or whatever it was.
Economics in One Lesson. I had. I don't think I do anymore.
Yeah, Economics in One Lesson. That seems to me the logical book to read after this one, because clearly this guy's wrong. But I also think understood Hazlitt's wrong too. But that's the point of view.
I think, yeah. I mean, would it be useful to kind of? I mean, I guess it would help us understand how, because I don't think that many people really fully understood Hayek's argument, and maybe Hazlitt's did go further towards sort of popularizing this in the in America. There's some weird, interesting things hidden in here. I was on where am I? I'm on page, according to my Kindle, I'm on page 218, and he's talking about, and all of a sudden he's sort of waxing poetic about the Anglo-Saxons and this whole kind of, well, what happened about that the English have lost their esteem for their social traditions and their sort of classical liberalism and all this. The virtues which are held less and less in esteem and which constantly become rarer are precisely those on which Anglo-Saxons justly prided themselves and in which they were generally recognized to excel. You're muted, Chris.
I say that sounds like a whole lot of the rise of nationalism at the end of the long 19th century, and overlapped with, a lot of the now debunked, social Darwinism crazy.
And that's almost a little white man's burden thing.
If you want to talk, and everybody wants to think that, the UK is so crazy lily white. And when you think about the number of places that have invaded from hundreds of miles away, and it starts with the Romans in the first century AD, and then you've got, the thundering hordes invading from Germany and the continent, 4th, 5th, 6th century on. In fact, actually, they even invited. Well, they've got great names. Horset and Henga or something like that. They invited these German warlords to come in to save them, at some point. And then you have the Norse invading from above and the Vikings. And then those same Vikings actually settle in Normandy, France for a long time.
Right.
And Normandy actually comes from Northmen or Norsemen.
Right.
And then that Norman invasion from France, puts it all to a big end. And, it's just admixture after admixture after admixture. And this purity thing.
Yeah.
Just the biggest load of hooey that ever,
right.
Right.
Coming out of Britain. And even the people who built Stonehenge were replaced, apparently, according to David Reich, by, the Yamnaya or the Bell Beaker people or the corded ware people or whatever, back,
Yeah.
3000 BC-ish. Yeah. So, but it does seem like what he's calling attention to here is this, well, for all their faults and for all of the 45 trillion that they stole from India, which Tim has linked to in the chat also, they did build a railroad system in India, and they made those trains run on time. And that does seem to, it does seem to sort of beg the question also,
Yeah, but
what he's talking about in this
we
chapter.
did make them pay for the trains.
Yeah. Well, we used their money to build it, to build the rail system.
Well, you gave them trains, but then you made them sit on the roofs
On the
to
top,
actually travel anywhere. So,
but this chapter does seem to be sort of leading to this is the one on the kind of the international order right here at the end. And so how, right, and this really maybe, although his all of his sort of vague, and expansive use of the word planning is problematic throughout the thing. This is where, maybe history, maybe what was the future for him has kind of justified his whole approach, in my mind, because now we've got this global order, right? Now we've got this whole globalization thing, which, is run by non-governmental groups and super governmental groups and organizations. And so,
well, we don't think of it in the same way either, but watching the debate on this big, beautiful bill for the last, 2 weeks or so, and, it shows up in a 900-page some odd document that, to a great extent, not a lot of people have read.
Right.
Or the ones who've read have read chunks and are reporting on small sub-chunks. But when you think about it, it is writ large government planning.
Mm-hmm.
Like, here's where we're going to spend our money and effort and time on for literally the next decade in large swaths of energy policy, economic policy, tax policy,
just figuring out what it means and how possibly to apply it or to avoid.
But we don't think of that sort of government planning in the same negative way that Hayek is discussing his government planning, in some part because there is, heavy capitalism that's interplaying while we're doing all this.
Well, and everybody's getting their little earmark. But the interesting thing about it is one of the excuses that I heard when people were kind of criticizing, why does it have to be one monster, multi-thousand page bill, with everything in it once and for all, big, beautiful or big, ugly, whatever. And the response that I heard that was interesting, to whatever extent it's true, was that you couldn't do this in smaller bills because of the way that Congress and the Senate have organized themselves to sort of prevent anything from going through. And that you had to have something that had so much pork and so many earmarks and so many incentives for people to go along that you couldn't sort of peel one thing out and say, okay, in this bill today, we're going to deal with energy policy. And in this bill, we're going to deal with, medical.
Yeah, you wouldn't get anywhere. You'll notice like the number of substantive bills that this House and Senate pass in this administration will be a big goose egg. That, they'll have small things for naming parks and roads and knucklehead stuff.
Yep.
And you'll get, SB 555 for, Joe's pothole.
Mm-hmm.
But the number of substantive things that get passed and dealt with is going to be almost nothing. So it's how do you slide in what you can on this massive Christmas tree bill?
Yeah.
Literally to the tune that you'll have, I've seen people flaming Murkowski and even Murkowski herself saying, hey, we shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
but she votes yes because she gets the thing she wants for her little fiefdom.
Right.
And most of the back and forth about whether this thing happened or not, you'll notice also has been tagged with the words being primaried. If
Mm-hmm.
you don't vote for this, we will primary you. Like, and that's literally the big carrot and stick
Well,
for
right.
how you even get it in the first place.
If you do vote for it, Elon will primary you, and if you don't vote for it, Trump will primary you. So who are you more afraid of?
Yeah. Well, I should be more afraid of the person with the money who's actually going to carry things out.
Right. Yeah.
And Trump is not generally not very good at carrying a lot of things out.
His-
And I don't think he has the money. He has the political will, but he doesn't have the money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. So, well, and that's the thing is that the whole, yeah, I'm not convinced that Musk will either, Pat, but I think it's weird that we have these, I mean, and again, it's these weird kind of coalitions of interests that don't naturally mesh, but have been sort of cobbled together.
Yeah.
This whole question, over the period that this Iran, conflict has been playing out of, is this, how does MAGA feel about that? And then it was, well, what is MAGA?
Yeah.
And
Well, you also are now seeing too, there's a big pendulum, and obviously the pendulum is sitting at about as far right as it can be. But I think there are a lot of people who are literally so pissed off that the pendulum is now swing. It's not going to swing to the center,
Mhm. Yeah.
which you see in this New York City mayoral race. It's, the guy who just made it through as a Democratic socialist. So it's this thing is going to swing way
And
back
it
to
doesn't
the
sound he actually doesn't even sound very democratic. I mean,
yeah.
he sounds like he is fully kind of steeped in really that whole sort of Jacobin to Verso, kind of way left, yes, we seriously do believe in Marxist Leninist.
Although I don't know how much the rest of the country is going to swing that heavily that far. But
No,
at the same time, too, I'm seeing today headlines of Musk saying, "Hey, let's create a third party." Although where that third party actually is, or where he envisions it being, I don't know. And how do you peel off
well,
huge
and who do
smoke?
you right and who do you go after, right? Does he go after his sort of potentially natural allies, kind of the tech bros, or does he go after the sort of the Dave Smith, libertarian former Trump supporters, who really want to, kind of keep us out of wars,
But the other problem too is the old fiscal conservative group of the Republican Party that's
Mhm.
broadly in the center. I don't know if there is enough of that center left that this still calls itself Republican that isn't far right wing, dyed in the wool identity, right wing Republicans right now. They're out there. They're talking and they have
Well,
Substacks.
yeah, and how big is the evangelical, end time dispensationalist, wing that's
Yeah.
just looking to support Israel so that, they can get all of the territory they need and knock down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple so that
Yeah.
Jesus would come.
Although I would say too broadly in the demographics I've seen, it was young men who broadly inched Trump and the Republicans into the win column with was it like a 1.5% margin.
Mhm.
None of this bill or anything that's been going on has been improving numbers for those
For them, right. Yeah.
young men at all. So they're going to be so heavily disenfranchised by the end of this 4 years.
Mhm.
Does that, so
Well, and the
it's a
question
game
is,
of
will
small
they
numbers
notice,
too.
or will somebody be able to distract them by way of some new identity crisis?
Well, but that's the thing is if you're going to create a new party, a third party somewhere in the middle or wherever it happens to be, if you're Musk, do you go after the Joe Rogans who are influencing that young male vote? and where do you lead them to
Right.
make things either better for them individually, but also the country as a whole, which is the the
Their
heart of the
promised land.
piece.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if we get, it's weird because there is no, I mean, there are just too many needles to thread and they're too far apart from each other. Right. So if we remove 10 or 20 million illegal aliens, we'll never do that. But if we did, right, and we have, currently the unemployment rate, I think this month or this quarter dropped from 4.2 to 4.1%. They expected it to bump up a little bit, but it actually is kind of continuing to slide. So who's gonna do all of these things that they're people have said, and I think probably rightly, that it's an insult to Americans to say, well, there's just jobs Americans will refuse to do and they're just too lazy and entitled and all of that to pick the strawberries and shit like that, and that seems to me to be kind of a lame excuse, right? If you paid them and you gave them health insurance, they would probably do it. But you don't want to do that. So
Yeah.
you kind of perpetuate a system where you tell yourself they won't do that so that you can bring in people that you don't have to pay a minimum wage and you don't have to provide any benefits for, and you can treat like shit. So, but
Yeah,
those are the people who are running things, the Central Valley farmers.
well, that becomes a big issue too. You hit all these big farms, and California farms are supplying the food
Yeah.
for half the country. It's and most people don't think about it at all, but when you can't get strawberries in 6 months,
Yep.
and you can't get lettuce, you can't get, it's all these immigrants who are picking this stuff,
Right.
that's doing it. But the other piece too, and it kills me when we got to the tail end of this book, it was almost like he had the prescience to see it, but the fact that it's the underlying document of a huge swath of the Republican Party platform for the last 75 years, you have chapter 10 titled "Why the Worst Get on Top," and then chapter 11 is the end of truth. When you've got the end of truth, and I think that's a big piece that makes the needle you were talking about so hard to thread, is as Americans, we have lost through the late 60s through the 80s. We had at least the Cold War focusing the kind of national effort on,
Right.
we're against this.
Right.
But we now as a country, and in 2001, suddenly we're against Muslims and we're against terrorism for maybe a decade.
Right. And now
And we're still scared of these things, but we don't have a big boogaboo, the big scary man that we're fighting against. And as a result, we're now fighting against each other internally.
Mhm.
So unless you can, and Trump doesn't seem to be picking the people we've been against in the past, the North Koreas, or, he's not pro-China, but he's not pro anybody really. He's against everybody because it's America first.
Right.
But that doesn't lead us into a place of, as a nation, we can all get behind at least one thing.
Right.
And there's no one thing we're all behind. We're all divided on all the issues. So threading that needle is stupidly hard unless you can find the one thing to get everybody at least kind of back on the same path on something. I mean, we're not even all on the plan of just pro-democracy now. Some are pro-democracy and some are pro-totalitarianism and going down that road.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's weird though, because and to go way back, an hour and a half, to the kind of the beginning of our conversation, right? That thing that HCR, kind of called out, right? This, and that Abraham Lincoln was alluding to, and that she called, attention to Abraham Lincoln alluding to in the Gettysburg Address, that, that this is, that freedom, and democracy should not, disappear from the earth. What did it mean? And to those people, right? To the people who fought that conflict, because clearly they had a range of ideas about how democratical, to use the term that Don Adams used against Thomas Paine, how democratical should it be? And clearly Adams didn't think it should be very, right? There were, and he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, and it's pretty restrictive. Another thing though that I've become more, as I've been thinking about it the last week or so, because I heard it about a week ago. Apparently Elon Musk posted a tweet that said that he was that Grok 3.5, which he said might rightly be called Grok 4, would get involved in this kind of big project of redefining all of humanity's knowledge and taking out all the errors and sort of codifying it and making it available to everybody. And I read that, and then I read it, and I was like, I did a double take, and I read it again. I was like, holy shit, could this be more Orwellian?
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem. That's the problem too, is it's not so much knowledge and what is truth, which, we've been seeking truth for millennia and are no closer to finding it than, is what we've read in Hayek all completely truth? There was some really fascinating stuff. I think I think it was chapter 12. There was a lot of like really kind of deeper arguments for or against socialism than I had read broadly that I got to dig into.
Mm-hmm.
Or would be interesting to dig into. I don't know if I honestly have the time to do it, or that it matters so much now in the broader scheme of,
Well, it is funny. I mean, I was sort of feeling the same way. At one point, I was listening, and he says, and I think the audio book that I'm reading is incorporating some of the endnotes or the footnotes, because at some point he says, this comes from Beatrice Webb and her husband, and page like 1039, and I was like, holy shit, I should read the Webb's analysis of this history, but Jesus Christ, do I need does it really need to be 1,000 pages?
And all of it goes back really to Graeber's thesis of there's many ways you can choose to live your life. And the question is, which ones are you going to choose?
Mm-hmm.
So there were,
Yeah. But I do think that buried in here, especially in these notes, are some really good sources that I really ought to pursue that will give me more insight into, sort of what the hell happened, especially between the First and Second Wars, and and in the aftermath of World War II, as we developed this sort of new global program of turning the League of Nations into the UN, and and instituting the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and all of this stuff that kind of comes out, and that since then has been argued about substantially by the people who sort of follow in Hayek's footsteps as well.
Although interesting too, in reading this and the density of the arguments that are going on. So, there are not many. I don't think there's anybody in the current instantiation of the Republican Party that really could go back and delve in and think and quote. There's almost no one I would expect to see on, let's say, a Sunday morning talk show quoting Hayek as some kind of underlying structure for what they're doing now, which is, to me, seems very odd. It's, we're getting out of an era, I think, where Hayek means anything to the current Republican Party in the way that he did even a decade ago, potentially.
Right. Or even the libertarians, right? Because for the most part, they don't go that far back. The libertarians who are prominent now, like Dave Smith, for example, he's fairly well read, but his reading, extends back to like, Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard, and not, that much, not really the primary documents of the Austrians. Although maybe I'm not giving him credit for that. Yeah, and they do. And Reagan, Reagan famously claimed that Ludwig von Mises was his favorite economist, which at the time made me laugh because I was relatively sure that he had never read.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
you got to have.
I had a copy of Human Action on my shelf at the time, and it's
Yeah, yeah. You ask any 14-year-old who's your favorite musician, they're going to come up with a name, whether they really know them well or not. But
right. Yep.
the only thing that's changed this week is fewer people are prone to say, John Combs he's the guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lately my favorite musician has been, I've been really into Gil Scott-Heron for the last 2 months.
Oh wow.
And but even at that, I think of him more as a poet and a writer than I do as a musician. So,
yeah.
But at least I've been actually listening to his oeuvre rather than.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Right. Right. So
Reagan, who just waves his hands and says "Southern strategy."
Right. Right. Yeah. So I've heard people whose money I want have said Mises. So it's Mises. Opposition outweighed support by yeah. I think it is such a beast of it almost seems to me that the best thing that they can do right now for their political fortunes is to distract people from actually thinking about this bill that's just been.
Which is why the delayed action on so many parts.
Yeah.
It's the problem won't land until the next guy is in. So it's not even Republican defense, it's Trump defense. And
Yeah.
Trump will not be there one way or the other.
Right. Right.
We are at about the 10-minute mark and
Yes.
haven't come to a new book.
Right.
Mm.
I hesitate a little bit. I would be willing to read Economics in One Lesson. I hesitate because of of how adjacent it is to this. Is there anything else that we've got on our radar that we want to consider? Let me see if I can get the book club vault open. Anybody got anything you want to nominate?
The only other thing that is parallel to this, the 60, that is not just pure economics, would be something like there's a book by Bill Lundberg, How to Spend $1 Trillion, How to Spend $1 Billion Saving the World, where he tries to make the economic arguments better.
How about what about Why Empires Fall? Or what about Who Owns the Future?
Who's the author for Who Owns the Future?
That's Jaron Lanier.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting.
Or yeah, we've also got Who We Are and How We Got There. If we wanted to go a little bit away from economics and the current problem. We've got The Notebook. And next
The Notebook could at least be a lighter, fluffier summer thing for us.
Could be fluffier. And Nexus also, I think, is probably, I'm going to guess it's fluffier just because it's Harari. But maybe that's exposing my bias.
Or at least fluffier from our perspective.
Yeah.
Hayek was a pretty dense.
It was
bit of.
It was dense. Yep.
In fact, I've just picked up and started reading Kant's critique on practical reason.
Wow.
Which makes Hayek seem like a light, fluffy summer read, but
right. Yeah. Yeah, I won't be available next week, so we'd have 2 weeks to start reading. But I would vote for a Nexus or a Notebook or a Who We Are and How We Got Here. I think you'll like that because that has some surprises along the way, and he writes fairly well. He sort of narrates the surprises pretty well. David Reich does.
Yeah, I could go with any of those. Which one's got the most votes so far?
Well, probably Lanier does just by virtue of, but it's people who aren't here, but maybe they come back. Of us, I think probably the note.
Or maybe which one's the most fun?
Yeah. The Notebook might be the most fun.
Well, let's do that. That's
Right.
probably better for a quiet summer than it is for.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Is everybody cool with that? The Notebook? A History of Thinking on Paper by Roland Allen, 2023. So at least it's recent. Tim, what about that one? What about the Notebook? Okay. Cool. Cool. All right. Then
Palate cleanser.
palette cleanser. And yeah, and why don't we let me take a look at it and see what it actually looks like. Show me a picture of it. Wait a second. Let me look at what the table of contents looks like. There are a lot of chapters. Holy crap, there are a lot of chapters. There are 30 chapters and a conclusion. So I imagine they're
First 6 chapters of the intro.
intro, and the first 6 would take us to the 16th century. Sure.
Wait, through which chapter?
Newton and Galileo.
Newton and Galileo? Where's that?
15th, 16th century.
Huh.
Well, it's roughly about 400 pages too. So if you do 100 pages a week,
Yeah.
and it's not heavy, dense reading.
Right. So 100 pages would be, yeah,
through chapter 7, maybe.
chapter 7. Yeah. I don't know what LHD 244 is, so that'll be interesting. Okay, through chapter 7. Looks good. Oh, and then chapter 9 is commonplace books. So you can give them a reality check.
No meet next week. It's difficult.
Are you looking in the actual book, Chris? Nice. All right.
For the really, this is the inside book cover. So, if you're
Oh wow! So you can make your notes. Cool.
if you're a friend of Adler,
Yeah.
he's done the work for you.
Right. Cool. All right. Well, that'll be the thing then. So I will be I'll be getting myself. I'll probably get an electronic copy of it, so I can listen while I'm driving. So, okay. Yeah, did I have any other things on? Yeah, one of the things that I thought was interesting too was sort of the idea of consequences and, action and consequences that Hayek seemed to be, trying to suggest was best served by not by planning, but by, something as chaotic as, and I think he, during that period when I jotted that down, he was sort of admitting the chaos sort of inherent in market forces, but and that has been one of their sort of compelling arguments is that, that this is the best, worst alternative.
I think the thing that struck me most at the end of the day was for a guy writing about government and planning, he spent way more time talking about government versus individuals or even capitalism as a potential solution.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't, and I kind of wish he had spent more time on where the capitalism piece gets us.
Yeah.
Particularly in a time period where there was more mixed government and mixed economy.
Yeah.
And he focuses all on government and almost none of it on the other side. When what ended up happening was capitalism totally won. And we really don't talk about, or there's been a huge movement since at least Reagan and even before against getting rid of government intervention of any sort, of any type.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things that government doesn't solve, or that capitalism can't solve, the government needs to.
Right.
And there's almost none of that here.
Right. Well, and there's, and he was sitting in London, apparently, or adjacent London, close to London, and maybe those were the most obvious examples for him. But yeah, he sort of missed an opportunity, or passed up on an opportunity to talk about America and the New Deal, and a bunch of things that had happened in that that were very contemporary in that period that he was.
Yeah.
But
And
maybe would have caused him to modify his, I don't know if they would have changed his mind, but at least he would have had to respond to them in a way that would have been, enlightening.
Yeah. So for me, the best part about getting into heaven is or maybe going to hell, is that I run into Hayek and I get to ask him, so what do you think about what you wrote and how things turned out?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Well, yeah, that's what, that was what Keynes said. In the long run, we're all dead. But yeah, but this, yeah, I hope I'm gonna try to make some time to go back through and understand, kind of what he's saying about the Webbs and Gladstone and Disraeli and Carlyle and Morley and, all of these people, especially in the development, because that was another element that he was, that he could have foregrounded a little bit more, or put a little bit more of a spotlight on, was sort of the British classical liberal tradition, and how that was not the British Liberal Party tradition, maybe, and how it was not, exactly the tradition that he was hoping to promote. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was a good, I don't know. I felt like it was mostly an overview read, and now I need to go back and do the analytical read.
I agree.
But that's going to be a lot of work.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe after we've done that, we'll maybe revisit it.
Or I'm sure we'll get into other economic stuff later, and then it becomes a comparative read, or a synoptic read with other stuff, looking back with what we've got. So,
which
it was an interesting exercise. It was a dramatically different exercise than I anticipated it would be when we started.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like I don't feel like I've completely got my arms around it, but I have more incentive to do that now than I did. So I guess that's progress.
Yeah.
All right.
Somehow.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, it was good talking. Thanks. And see you in 2 weeks.
A week off, 2 weeks. Okay.
All right. Ciao.
Take care, folks.